Welcome to our webinar on the Raleigh Affordable Housing Bond. I'm Diana Wynn, President of the League of Women Voters of Wake County. This year, Raleigh residents will have the opportunity to vote on an affordable housing bond. The League of Women Voters of Wake County has a very active affordable housing committee, and the National League of Women Voters has long advocated for affordable housing opportunities. Based on our committee's review of the bond issue and consistent with national LWV-US positions, the League of Women Voters of Wake County has officially endorsed the Raleigh Affordable Housing Bond that appears on the 2020 ballot. Before we begin, I want to briefly explain how we are using the Zoom platform for this webinar. Except for the presenters, everyone is muted and you're not on video. We're not using the chat feature in Zoom. Instead, please type your questions in the Q&A screen. If you hover your computer mouse near the center bottom of the Zoom screen, a menu will appear. You should then be able to click on the Q&A option. At the end of the presentation, the speakers will be asked your questions. We will try to ask as many of your questions as we can. Please don't wait until the end of the presentation to submit your questions. Suzanne Botts, our Affordable Housing Committee co-chair, will monitor the questions submitted and will serve as our moderator for the Q&A portion of this session. I'd now like to turn the program over to our Affordable Housing Committee co-chair, Robin Hammond, who will introduce the speakers.
Thank you, Diana. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank y'all for being with us today. Speaking with us today, we have Yvette Holmes, who's with DHIC. She's been with them since 2012. She's got lots of experience in affordable housing. She served as a co-chair for the city's Affordable Housing Advisory Board, and she is also a co-chair for Citizens Supporting the Raleigh Bond. We also have with us today Chris Sinclair, who is a campaign and political strategist, and he is working with the bond, so he will have some information for us. And John Goodman is Vice President of Government Affairs for the Greater Raleigh Chamber of Commerce. And now I'll just turn it over to Yvette.
Good afternoon. Just waiting for the PowerPoint to come up. Hope everyone's doing well. While they bring up the PowerPoint, just wanted to first thank the League of Women Voters, Diana, Suzanne, and Robin for inviting us in to share a few comments and information about the bond. Want to also congratulate the League for their centennial commemoration that took place last month. Learned a great deal about the League and the history of the League and its beginnings and how it started out of the women's suffrage movement. And it's appropriate that we are here today talking about the bond and how housing, of course, impacts so many, but particularly women and children. So thank you for this platform. I am here only as one of 4 co-chairs of the Citizens Supporting Raleigh group. I joined with the other co-chairs, former Mayor Meeker, Charles Meeker, Asa Fleming, and Billy Redmond, and the entire committee, and thanking you again for this opportunity. We thought maybe as we get started, we know there might be some who may not be able to stay on for the full call. I thought maybe it would be good if we can go to the next slide and just share a little bit overview of the Raleigh Affordable Housing Bond campaign. And I might also add, I want to thank Chris and John for joining and making themselves available to answer questions, and you'll hear more from them as we go through the presentation. And so the Raleigh Affordable Housing Bond is an $80 million bond that is put and placed on the ballot for this year. It's a ballot initiative. Encourage everyone to obviously get out and vote this year. Make sure you turn your ballot over because the bond initiative is on the lower half of the bond on the back side. So please make sure you turn your ballot over. The bond would only be voted on by Raleigh residents. It will result in a property tax increase of $20.07 per median home value of about $250,000. It is expected to yield and result in about 1,700 units over the next 5 years, starting in July of 2021. And you'll hear more about the various individuals and families that will benefit from the bond. So if you leave with nothing else, we asking for your support of the bond. Here, of course, to answer any questions that you may have, but if you're not able to stay on for the entire call and webinar, please remember that we are making the ask and hope that you join us. So go to the next slide, please. It's also important that we give a little history about the Affordable Housing Bond and the work of the advisory committee that was formed earlier this year. There were some questions in the community about the engagement process, and we thought maybe it would be good to take some time to go over exactly how we got here. The Affordable Housing Bond initially came about in 2019. The former council wanted to explore a bond, and I think given the time frame and the steps you have to go through to get a bond on the ballot, it's my understanding that it may not have been enough time to make that happen. Also, there was not engagement at that time to support a bond and support from the community. And so the new council kind of hit the pause button and decided that they would do a level of engagement to get input from the community as to their interest and desire to support a bond. And in February of 2020, the Affordable Housing Bond Committee was formed, 24 members. I served as one of the co-chairs, as did Paul Kane. And we were fortunate enough to lead a group of 22 other community members, a variety of folk from, who are familiar with this work, those who are have a passion for just serving the community and making sure that the needs of the community are met. So there's a good cross section of individuals. We held 14 meetings over the course of between February and May. We could not have anticipated COVID-19, and I don't think any of us could have. And so it was our initial plan and desire to have these one-on-one meetings, or in-person meetings, should I say, and that all had to change due to COVID-19. And we made our final recommendations on May 19th to City Council, and we'll talk a little bit more about the process. Can you go to the next slide, please? It was good, thought it was important to give you a list of those committee members that made up the Raleigh Affordable Housing Bond Advisory Committee. Highlighted here for your benefit, the nonprofits and other for-profit organizations that actually work in this space and serving those populations most in need. I understand that there have been some concerns as to whether or not those most impacted by this issue did not have a voice in this process, but we felt very confident that we conducted outreach in such a way that we were able to get the input, at least representation of those who are impacted. I believe their voices were at the table. Just to go to the next slide to share. You have a list there of some of the organizations that participated on the advisory committee. And if you will note there that these are reputable nonprofits that have been around for many years serving the needs of the community. And many serve the 30% AMI population, 40, 50% on up to 80% AMI. And so again, feel very confident. We said during our meetings that we had, for those, we had a couple of in-person meetings, and then we kind of pivot to the Zoom that, you know, it was their obligation as organizations to come to that process representing those constituents that they served, and that if they didn't do that, certainly they were not doing any good or not of service to those organizations or to the people that they serve. So they felt, I hope, very comfortable bearing and bringing those perspectives to the conversation that we had. We did have an individual that actually lived in one of the communities of the organizations that you see here. I also will note that we're very sensitive to the fact that we don't always get to know who's had a lived experience. I believe sometimes those things are very personal in nature, and we did not ask anybody to come to the meeting bearing their history and sharing what sometimes can be very sensitive experiences. Next slide, please. When we think about the outreach and engagement, I mentioned earlier that we held 14 meetings, combination of in-person conference calls, Zoom meetings. We were not using Zoom back in February and March the way we're using Zoom today. I think we've all learned a lot over the last few weeks, how to make technology work for us. We certainly published the dates and times of our meetings, and the public was invited to participate, though only as observers. They could not weigh in on the conversation at the time, but many observers found ways to get information to us, be it via chat or emailing us directly, and we tried to you know, answer and be responsive to those questions. We also know that the committee that was formed had many contacts in the, you know, outside of the committee. And so we know that many committee members had their own kind of one-on-one conversations with various ones in the community. We had the website, we, you know, used social media and the like, and had one-on-one calls as mentioned. Next slide, please. So when we had to pivot from our in-person meetings, you know, matter of fact, we had already secured a location. Our plan was and strategy was to have these in-person meetings throughout, you know, the city of Raleigh. We were going to do it by district, and we had already, were close to securing a location for our first in-person meeting. Then of course, COVID-19 happened. So we were trying to figure out how can we still engage and get the input from Raleigh residents. Essentially, they are the ones, and we are the ones who will ultimately vote for this, hopefully in support of the bond. So we came up with the electronic or e-survey, both in English and Spanish, and then we just distributed in mass numbers electronically throughout using the city's listservs. We did placement ads in various publications. We were happy with the results. Next slide, please. Where we got over 4,800 participants or responses to the survey, probably far more than we would have gotten if we were to do in person, but nonetheless, we did make the survey available, obviously electronically, but then we also created an option for individuals who did not feel comfortable using technology to call in to the city of Raleigh and to conduct their survey via phone. So we had, you know, fewer than 50 or so that took advantage of that, and that was great to have that as an opportunity and option for some. We found that in the survey results that there were a range of support for all levels of the bond. So, you know, we put out there an option of a $50 million bond, a $75 million bond, and a $100 million bond. And overwhelmingly, the results came back that individuals either agreed or strongly agreed to support all levels as proposed. And we had good cross representation throughout the, you know, city of Raleigh and different districts and the like. So we were happy with the results. And next slide, please. So in conversation with the committee, it was, I thought, you know, it was a good discussion. We had individuals who were part of the committee who were, you know, well-versed in affordable housing, some who were new to this and were just curious, who brought a perspective that was, really useful to shaping our considerations and recommendations ultimately to City Council. And so the bond package considerations, and let me maybe stop and say that when we were formed, we were presented with these 5 buckets, which you'll see in a moment. We were not the ones to come up with the 5 buckets as described, that they were presented to us and we were to take the recommendations or the proposal that was presented to us and share that out with the community for feedback. And so each of the buckets had a set of allocations or of the bond proceeds assigned to it. And we were considering whether or not those allocations were appropriate, if they needed to change, or do the buckets need to change? Do we need to add one, take one away? And so those were the kinds of things that we were talking about. And in our discussion, based on the input that we were getting from the survey that we got from the survey, we first decided that we were going to do an $80 million bond, that we felt like a $100 million bond would be a stretch given the economy and the uncertainty of the the economy, given all that's going on with COVID-19. But we also wanted to do a stretch, right? Like we wanted to, the $75 million, we said we'll do something a little more than 75 million, but not quite go to 100 million. And we felt comfortable with that. We also, through that conversation, there was great feedback about there being a need to serve those and focus the bond on those at greatest need, those at 30% median income and below. And we even went as far as to ask the city staff to give us some data on the units that they targeted and had set aside for this population over the last 5 years. And to be honest with you, the numbers weren't as hopeful. There was certainly a lot of room for improvement. Think of the 2,700 or so units that they supported maybe in the city, fewer than 100 had been set aside or targeting this 30% population. So we wanted to create a baseline so that we can at least measure our accomplishments moving forward. So I think it's important to note that when we had our conversations, we were keenly aware of the need, and there were many organizations at the table who, and individuals who were committed to ensuring that there was something in this bond to serve that population. Also, you'll see it was the nonprofits. There's a public-private partnership bucket. Again, you'll see that in a minute. We changed the allocation. There was, I think 25% of the bond proceeds, and we altered that slightly. And we wanted to see more of the bond proceeds dedicated to the public-private partnership, because it is there that you can fund what you would call the smaller affordable housing developments or projects that don't qualify for tax credits. So it gave and would give nonprofits that flexibility and the resources needed to go ahead and seek opportunities to bring online other affordable housing units, again, that don't qualify for your LIHTC deals. Next slide, please. So here are the buckets that I mentioned, and I'm laughing every time I say buckets, because some people have said, why buckets? Probably is just the easiest way to describe it. Nothing more than that. The transit-oriented site acquisition of the $80 million is now recommended that 20% of that be set aside. I believe the original recommendation was closer to 30. So we scaled that back a little bit. And we moved some of that to the public-private partnerships, is what I mentioned earlier. And so the transit-oriented development is just looking at housing opportunities along the transit corridors and how we might preserve affordability along those corridors, and taking advantage, obviously, of the opportunity of it being located nearby transit. I think there's some question as to whether or not, can we know what those sites are? Well, really, to be frank about it, the answer to that is no, not at this time. We know where the transit corridors are per the planning on behalf of the city of Raleigh. But to identify those sites or even to make those sites public at this time would probably be doing ourselves a disservice. You know, and that's really the work of the developer to propose those sites to the city and the city staff to look for those opportunities. But those things sometimes have to be done quietly so that we can ensure that the city or a developer can go in and acquire those properties almost quietly, because once you kind of put a bullseye on it, it's hard to rein that in. And some market developer with deep pockets could easily go in and just acquire those sites and buy them from underneath us, and then they're no longer affordable. So some of this is just a work in progress. The public-private partnerships, that is just an opportunity there, like I mentioned earlier, for particularly nonprofits and private developers to look at ways in which we can achieve smaller scale affordable housing opportunities or pursue those opportunities, and to have the flexibility and resources to do so. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a little bit. And then our low income housing tax credit gap financing. Most people are familiar with that. That's probably the surest way, most successful way that affordable housing is developed and paid for. It's highly successful models managed. The low-income housing tax credit program is managed by the North Carolina Housing Finance Agency, highly competitive. We compete by region, and those credits as allocated like a per capita formula. And the Housing Finance Agency determines how those credits are distributed across the state. And so it is a great way to build out the capital stack to afford to pay for the cost of building and developing housing. We'll talk a little bit about that as well. And then owner-occupied home rehab. We do see this as an opportunity here, though we scaled that back just a tad bit, but this is work that the city of Raleigh already does, and we're proposing that we add more resources to that. We do see this as, an anti-gentrification strategy, a way to combat gentrification, because you have people who live, particularly our seniors, our elders, and those who have very modest incomes who can't afford repairs to their homes, but they want to remain in their homes. So these are like for major system repairs, roofing and AC, heating, cooling, that sort of thing. If we can, encourage individuals to take advantage of these resources, it certainly is a sure way that people can remain in their homes and stay in their communities. Down payment assistance, because we believe that, one sure way to build wealth is through home ownership. Right? And one way to ensure that communities remain viable and that people can remain in their communities that they desire to live in is that we offer the opportunity to enter into home ownership. And so the down payment assistance, particularly in this market where the home prices are like skyrocketing, it is almost out of reach, particularly for someone who's, at 50, 60, 80% AMI. It's out of reach, and the DPA helps to ensure that individuals who have, very limited resources can access homeownership and while also build wealth over time. Again, this bond, $80 million bond, would result in a property tax increase of about $20 per year on a home value of about $255,000. Next slide, please. This is part of the recommendations that were made at City Council. Staff provided council with some options on how they might further provide some guidance around how those dollars, bond proceeds might be used, and believe that certainly is in response to the work of the Affordable Housing Bond Advisory Committee. As I mentioned earlier, we asked and when we made our recommendations to council in May, we did so with and asked that an emphasis be placed on a 30% AMI household. And so the transit-oriented development, we've already talked about that a little bit. I won't go through each line item here. This is public record, was shared. You can go to the website, council agenda website, and pull this same slide down. and get more information. But there's a lot to unpack here. And, you know, ultimately we're talking about over 1,700 units over the period of 5 years. One thing we talked about, the transit-oriented development, we talked a little bit about the preservation, haven't talked about it, but I should mention the preservation of the naturally occurring affordable housing developments or NOAA projects. And, you know, there are a lot of kind of BC class properties that are out there that easily could be, I say easily, nothing's ever easy, but that considered to acquire or to incentivize the owner to extend the affordability period. So those properties are fallen, not wouldn't say somewhat disrepair, but they have already this naturally low rents because of the age. And so it's really, you know, when they kind of cycle through, the owner of that property easily could just, you know, ask people to move, put a little light touch of repairs, new flooring cabinets and the like, and then just, you know, increase the rent. And so in this market, that could easily happen, just given the demand for housing. So, you know, one of the goals is to really inventory those properties that are soon to expire the tax credit compliance period, and to work with those property owners, again, to incentivize them to work with developer or the city, county, to preserve as affordable. Then your public-private partnerships, as I mentioned before, there is an effort and recommendation here that council has approved to set aside some dollars for permanent supportive housing. The permanent supportive housing model is housing plus services. And what it does is kind of housing first, and it helps to serve those individuals who are chronically homeless, individuals who might be using, unfortunately, you know, the emergency rooms and shelters and jails, and kind of cycling in and out, or frequent users of those, I wouldn't call them services in the case of the jail, but who are using those ways in which to sustain themselves, or they might have, you know, other mental illness, or they might have other substance abuse challenges and the like. And so this whole idea is that if you get people into housing first, then you can, because they are, you know, stably housed, then you can help them to address the other challenges and barriers that they might have. And so that is a very expensive form of housing, but it's also far more cost effective to do that than it is to have these individuals continuously cycling through, you know, again, the emergency room and jails and the shelters. And so this would be done in partnership with Wake County, because it's something that both the county and the city certainly believe in. Then the public-private partnerships, I mentioned that already, with nonprofits especially, or other developers that might, you know, want to be a part of this. We are not going to be able to build our way out of this housing crisis. The nonprofits that do this work and the few for-profit developers that do this work won't be able to do all of the work. It's going to really require the entire community to join in and figure out ways that we, in more creative ways, might I add, that we can deliver more affordable units to the marketplace. And that could be done on a large scale, you know, moderate scale, or a small scale. A unit is a unit. And so we are just trying to figure out ways and create the capital needed to be able to explore those opportunities. Gap financing, mentioned that earlier, 9% versus the 4%. It is highly successful, most successful ways that affordable housing is built. The challenge there's just not enough credits to go around. You're not going to get, you know, the county might, you know, get a couple of projects a year approved or whatever. And you obviously at that clip, we're not going to ever be able to keep up. And I would note too, as we are adding units, you know, there's a chance that we're losing them too, right? So we want to see a net plus, we want to see a net gain. So, you know, having 1,700 units is great, but if, you know, if we've lost 500 at the end of 5 years, you know, that's not the direction we want to go in. And so, you know, when I say losing, you can lose those NOAA properties if you're not kind of anticipating or working with the property owners in advance. And so there's kind of multi-pronged approaches that we have to take to preserve, you know, the housing stock that we have. But the 9 and 4% deals, it takes more of subsidy to advance a unit using the credits because there's a greater gap in the capital stack. And so the city is proposing here that they would allow up to, you know, $35,000 per unit to help with that gap. Also understanding that that is also where they can help to serve the 30% AMI population. And so we'll talk a little bit about that a little bit more in the presentation. And then I mentioned first-time home buyers and the rehab. Next slide, please. So serving extremely low income households and those who are cost burden, you know, it is true that those who have far fewer resources have a harder time at finding housing. There is no arguing, debating that point. And there are people also who are, you know, cost burden, paying more than 30% of their income, household income on, you know, rent plus utilities or mortgage plus utilities. You are severely cost burdened if you're paying more than 50% of your household income on rent plus or mortgage plus utilities. And so HUD's kind of definition of as to whether or not and what's affordable, right? What's if you're not paying any more than 30% of your household income, then, you know, it's said to be that you're, you know, affording your home. And so we understand that there are people who are, you know, have living off a minimum wage, you know, $7.25 or $10 an hour. It's really not a lot, and who are probably extremely and severely cost burdened. And next slide, please. And so the emphasis that's placed on this population is founded, and we agree. I don't think we disagree on that. And so I just wanted to point that out for those who are also advocates for this population. We hear you and join with you in feeling that pain and understanding that there needs to be a strategy in which we can help serve that population more effectively. But maybe just for people's knowledge to see what the low income housing tax credit limits are for 2020, to give people a sense of what that might look like for some. You know, the AMIs are adjusted based on household size. So if you're one person at 30% AMI, you're, you know, a little over $19,000 is what is said to be the income limit. Is not what you're actually, is not to say what people are earning, is just to say, or what their incomes might be, is just to say that that's the kind of the ceiling. The AMI for household for the Raleigh-Wake County area is $94,000, and it has a lot to do with the salaries of high tech and good paying jobs, and it's hard to believe, and so that kind of skews it a little bit, right? Because there are people certainly who are far from making $94,000, and that's just the median, just to point that out. So this bond will support those at 30% on up to 80%. In the rental space, it tends to just support those at 60% and below. When you get into the 80% AMI, that's where your down payment assistance comes into play to help support up to 80% those households, to help them achieve homeownership. So just to make some distinction, when we're talking about rental, it tends to be 60% AMI and below. Next slide, please. This also gives some idea as to what the rent limits are for 2020, and the limits for someone at 30% AMI, one bedroom, it's $529 is what HUD has said as their ability, what they can afford. Now these limits here, these rent limits also include utilities. So it's probably good to note that, if you were to back out 15% or so of this to allocate towards utility costs, and that's your, your electric and your water, sewer. It varies by property. Some properties sub-meter, some properties pay for water. This varies, but just to give you a general sense. And I was looking at what, for instance, a one-bedroom fair market is. It's $1,022. $1,022. That's a lot. Imagine, obviously, for the person who's at any of these income levels would be hard pressed. And that's just the rent. $1,022 is not the rent plus utilities. So you could probably tack on another couple $100 for utilities on this fair market rent. And someone potentially could be paying $1,200, $1,300. So we understand that there is a need and that people's pain certainly is greatly felt. Next slide, please. So just to help us understand, though we can do more in the space of serving those at 30% AMI, I think it's also important to know that that those at 30% AMI are being serviced, maybe not to the degree that we think they should be, but it's probably important to note that and how they are currently serviced and how they access housing currently. And that's not for every household. So just wanted to maybe point some things out. May I go to the next slide, please? When we talk about the Raleigh Housing Authority, I know there's a lot of most people are familiar with that model. And we asked them to provide some data, helping us to better understand who it is they serve. Public housing essentially is where the subsidy remains with the property, stays with the unit. And so they have been currently serving 1,400 or so across their portfolio. There are those, and if you can note here that the majority of who over 75% of who they serve are those at 30% AMI or less. And to apply to the housing authority, they mostly serve those at 50% AMI and below. So we just wanted to point that out. The same thing for what we call the mobile choice voucher. Currently, they've issued over 3,500 of those vouchers, whereby 83% of those who are voucher holders, close to 3,000, are at 30% AMI. And so, we could say that not everyone has a voucher. And you'll see, next slide, please. You can see where there's a wait list. Over 4,100 people on the wait list for public housing alone, another 6,500 on the wait list for the choice voucher. And the way I think about it is, the people who have the voucher have what I would consider currency, that they can go out into the marketplace and, shop for housing. What they're challenged with now is private landlords don't have to accept that form of payment. And so that is not the case for any property that is supported or funded in part by the city of Raleigh or the county, for that matter. That is a requirement that we, as those of us who do affordable housing, that we have to accept the payment. So many folk who live in our communities, a good percentage of that, and we'll go to the next slide, if we may, that you will see that many of them are also, lost my train of thought. Many of them are also making use of the vouchers. So when we did a little small sampling and asked the city of Raleigh to go back and look at 13 of their properties that were recently funded, we wanted to know, so it's one thing to have units that are set aside for that targeted population. And then when you drill down a little bit more, that though those units may not have been set aside for that population, who's actually occupying the units? Because keep in mind, the person who has the voucher, like I mentioned just a minute ago, they have currency, right? So they can go to a landlord and say, hey, I can afford to pay the higher rent because now I have a voucher that is valued at set amount. And though they might be themselves 30% AMI household, they have a way in which they can afford the higher rents. So when you look at the mix of that, it's not enough to say what the set aside units are for that population. You have to drill down a little bit more and ask the question, who's actually using or living in those units and how are they paying for that? Again, it's oftentimes through some subsidized voucher issued by the local housing authority. Go to the next slide, please. That same question was asked of certain public or permanent supportive housing communities or developments that were supported by the city of Raleigh, and that same question holds true. 3% of the units that they supported, they being the city, serve the 30% or targeted the 30%. But then when you ask the question, who's actually living in those units, of course, again, the voucher holders, you certainly saw an increase in that percentage. You can also note that average subsidy per unit for those is close to $50,000. Next, please. So mention the public-private partnership. So the question that I'm answering here is, how are we serving the 30% AMI population? And again, from recommendation from the advisory committee, we appreciate the city and the staff being responsive to that and making some recommendations, city to the council, as to how we can achieve that. And so this is again achieved through this public-private partnership where $10 million is proposed to be set aside to help support those permanent supportive housing units, the 50 units that I mentioned. More Place is a model in Charlotte where they have a permanent supportive housing community. If you want to check that out and see what that model here in Raleigh could look like, hopefully will look like once the bond passes. And then having some dollars set aside for the nonprofit partners to do just what I mentioned earlier. Won't repeat that, but how important it will be to ensure that we have the resources to be able to take advantage of the smaller scale affordable housing projects. Next slide, please. And then the city is also proposing that there be some set-asides or required that if you're going to come to the city for funding to help with your 9% and 4% tax credit deals, that you are committing to a certain number of set-aside units for the 30% population. For the 9%, the 25% set aside, for 4%, 10% of the units will be set aside to serve those who are at 30%. And to help achieve that outcome, they've also agreed or what the council has approved is to increase the amount of the contribution or subsidy that the city of Raleigh will make to help fill that gap, because there will be a gap. Obviously, the deeper the targeting, the more the gap. And we should probably note this a good time when, if we were to have a development where, large percentage of those units were set aside for those, and those living in those units were paying just 30% rents, there would be not enough revenue or income generated to cover the operations of the property or to service the debt on the property, and thereby putting the property at risk of not being sustained as affordable over time. So it's not just the short term, it's the long-term gain. Like we want to see affordable housing in perpetuity. And which is why having some higher rents mixed in helps to cross-subsidize the lower rents. And so you need a little bit of everything, which is why the advisory committee has never made a recommendation that all of the $80 million be allocated just for 30% AMI, as much as we would want to do that. And it seems like the logical thing to do given the need, We also know that the responsible thing to do is to make sure that we're sustaining these communities long-term, and that we have got to figure out a way to generate the income post-development, post-construction, to make sure that the properties remain viable. So to do that, again, you have to have some mixed income. Next slide, please. Wow, and so it's my time to turn the screen over to our two gentlemen that have joined or are joining, and John and Chris will tell you more about the Citizen Supporting Raleigh Committee and the great work that's happening there. And so I will turn it over. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Yvette. Can everybody hear me? I mean, am I on? I want to make sure
Yes.
that. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Yvette, and thank you to Robin and the League of Women Voters for putting this webinar together to help inform folks who are interested in the housing bond that's on the ballot this fall. My name's Chris Sinclair. I'm one of two consultants that are working on getting the vote out for this effort, which is a little different than what the city has done and what the city is doing to educate folks. We are I represent and work for the Raleigh Chamber of Commerce, who's put and the bond committee, who's put the committee of folks running the advocacy campaign for the bond to voters. So while I'm not going to talk to you today about the technical nature of the bond, I want to talk to you about what we're doing to help get the word out and how you all as citizens and folks within the league and the people listening today can get the message out about the importance of affordable housing and for voting for the bond on November the 3rd. I want to say first, again, thank you to the League. Appreciate all that you all do to help educate voters on a number of issues. And so we're very appreciative for this opportunity. I also want to give a shout out to Yvette, who has worked tirelessly, not only on this bond, but I've had the pleasure of knowing and working with Yvette, having served on the board of directors for the Downtown Housing Improvement Coalition and Greg Warren before Yvette. And they, as many of you may or may not know, they are doing a lot of good work and have done a lot of good work in Raleigh and around the region, along with other affordable housing developers. So many thanks to Yvette for her leadership, for her passion, for her attention to detail with regard to this effort, which is one of the biggest efforts for the city and affordable housing. And so we are honored to be a part of this. I'm honored to be a part of this effort as well. My background in both politics and advocacy is centered around housing and housing affordability for the real estate industries in the past. And I've worked with a lot of different organizations and understand that the need for affordable housing is critical to all of our communities, and especially the capital city. I also want to just mention that there's another affordable housing bond on the ballot this fall, and it's over in the Queen City, and they've made the same sort of commitment. The private sector has done a phenomenal job through Bank of America stepping up to the plate to address the affordable housing concerns of both the city of Charlotte and the region in general. And so this is an issue that is paramount and on the minds of a lot of different communities around the state and here in Raleigh as well. And so anyone that could sit back and say there's no need doesn't understand what's going on in the housing market. There's a tremendous need for housing and housing affordability and for getting folks into homes, whether it be in multifamily settings or in single family homes or repairing homes that they live in now. And it's just it's a community effort all around, but it's also a community need. And there seems to be a tremendous amount of support for this bond, not only as Yvette mentioned from the surveys that came back from citizens, but also in terms of voters themselves. And the chamber did some initial polling on this back earlier in the year and found a very nice baseline of support from voters. And so again, this is something that's on the voters' minds. It's something they've expressed an interest in. And hopefully on November 3rd, we'll put their money where their mouth is, so to speak, and vote for the bond. And so we feel like we have a well-vetted plan of action from the city, and the implementation of the bond will come once it's passed. But our job as the referendum committee, which also includes, again, led by the chamber, led by the business community, but with support from a cross-section of people and individuals who share the passion for ensuring that everyone can have access to safe, quality, affordable housing. And I don't think anyone can argue that, especially in the current times and with the pandemic, there are so many people that before the pandemic were in need, and now looking at how essential housing is for people who either have existing homes or want to move up into other homes, or live in apartments and want to move into homes, how important homes are to people, because they become, in a lot of cases, they become classrooms, and in a lot of cases, they become offices for people who are trying to keep the lights on and keep their paychecks coming. So having access to housing is important for a lot of folks. And while no bond campaign, or excuse me, no bond effort is ever perfect, putting it out there and putting it up for the voters to consider to address by the city is both bold and needed. I've had the luxury of working for a number of different bond referendums in Wake County, from transportation to school funding, and then statewide, working on the Connect NC bond effort, which put a ton of money into higher education for folks, as well as other efforts. And so the experience that we bring to the table is helping educate voters and then working with the committee to do so. There is another consultant on the effort, Brad Crone with Campaign Connections. Brad was unable to make it today, so I'm filling in for both of us. So if I could have the next slide, please, that would be great. Is there someone manning the slides that could put that up?
Chris, this is Diana. Am I not on the correct slide for you?
I just can't see it. Is there, excuse my Zoom ignorance.
You should be able to see it on your screen.
Oh, there we go. Sorry. I had to switch, I had share capability. I'm sorry, I had to switch to that. So the committee, the chamber, the business community did a really good job of reaching out and soliciting committee chairs for this bond campaign. Mayor Charles Meeker, who we all know and admire and respect for his leadership, taking our city in a new direction when he first was elected, and really did a phenomenal job for the city of Raleigh. Yvette Holmes, whom you've heard from, thank you, Yvette, and Billy Redmond with Trademark Properties, and then Asa Fleming, former president of the North Carolina Realtors and also a realtor with Allen Tate. So we feel like we have a very good set of leaders, and they have all done a tremendous job steering the bond referendum committee, the advocacy committee for this effort. Next slide, please. The affordable housing bond, voting yes on the affordable housing bond means we're building, as we said, a better, stronger Raleigh. Our messaging is around this. Our messaging is around the different aspects of the bond. and we're excited to get the word out. We all know that our future depends on this. We have a website for more information, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But we're again pushing out a message encouraging voters to vote yes for the bond. Next slide, please. Before we give you some different ways to take action to support the bond, I do want to say that we have a very coordinated effort with the committee, again, led by the chamber and the business community, and Adrian and John doing a great job there at the chamber, leading the effort, working with the committee as well. I will say that we've put together a comprehensive communications campaign, which we will be reaching out to voters directly and indirectly, directly through direct mail and digital advertising. We won't be doing, and some other print advertising. We will not be doing any TV advertising as.
Chris?
Yes, ma'am.
This is Suzanne. We're running very short of time. Do you mind
Okay.
if we move on to Q&A? We've got
Sure.
people really dying to ask some questions.
Sure. I'll just end by saying, and I apologize, I'll end by saying that on this slide, there are a number of different ways for anyone who wants to get involved to do so. Social media, requesting a yard sign, spreading the word, any information that you need. You have contact information there, jgoodman@raleighchamber.org. Need a sign or need something like that, we're happy to get that to you, and happy to help in any way.
Thank you so much. We have a lot of questions. I'm going to ask really quickly, and you guys can choose who will answer. I suspect it'll be a vet on the hot seat. The first question is, when will the funding, if this bond is approved, when will it be available so implementation can start? And is there an estimate of how long it will be before the first new affordable housing units are built?
Well, the actual property tax increase would not go into effect until 2021. So we have to get past the, public and community voting for the bond and support of the bond in November. And then all the kind of steps will follow for things to go into effect again as of July 2021. And so when will the first project be available? It'll probably be months out beyond July, because it doesn't happen. But the smaller affordable housing projects, like the smaller scale ones that I mentioned earlier, it could, I wouldn't say happen in short order, but may not take as long as the larger multifamily developments that are funded by tax credits.
So we had 8 questions, sort of summarizing it down to how many affordable units of these proposed of the 1,766 will be available for people at 30% AMI or lower?
It will depend on the, if we're going to just think about the tax credit developments that will be developed over the next 5 years, starting in July of 2021. As mentioned before, if the tax credit is a 4% deal, the requirement is that 10% of those units be set aside. If it's a 9% deal, the requirement will be that 25% of those units will be set aside. So we don't really know what those projects will be, but if you were to kind of use what the city, the last 5 years that the city has, based on their history of the last 5 years of what they've developed, there were over 2,200 units developed using the 4% credits. So you could just say 10% of those units, if the number is still the same, could be over 200. And then there were another close to 500 or 450 units that were funded by the 9% tax credits. And if we were to use the formula of 25% set aside, that could be another 100. So, it's hard to gauge Not to mention the other public-private partnerships, like I mentioned, the smaller scale developments that could also produce 30% units.
This may be a little bit outside your scope, but while owner-occupied home rehabilitation is commendable, how are these folks protected from the property tax increases that are inevitable? Can the city freeze their taxes as long as they remain in their home?
Chris, anybody want to take that? I know that's the county has a program, Wake County has a program, revenue department for persons who are low income, has some form of disability. And we probably can get some information out to folk about that. It's not a function of the city necessarily. We do know that there were programs, I think that Durham had attempted to put in place to help with some tax relief. I don't know how well utilized that program was. And so the bond proceeds could not support a project like that, though there might be other resources that the city of Raleigh could use to help, but we have not seen where that has been overly successful. I would recommend getting in touch with Wake County. And again, we can make those resources, that contact information available.
How and who will decide where the housing is going to be built?
That really is the job of the developer. You know, the private, the nonprofit, and private developers, whose job it is as part of the activities of a developer is to identify the appropriate sites. There are a lot of things to consider when you're thinking about funding, particularly if you're using tax credits, highly prescriptive. Those communities can be located, have to be nearby transit services and the like. And those sites are becoming really hard to find and more costly to find. And once you do find them, obviously costly to purchase. So that is a job as a developer. The city of Raleigh has its open process and invites applications and submissions and the like, and the process is then vetted from there.
There is lots of interest in how the bond funding will be used, particularly for the groups which are overburdened at 30% or below. Has this division or distribution, has it been decided completely after the approval so that planning can be beginning? Or is it possible that it may be changed if the economic situation changes or the council member changes, or some unforeseen thing happens that changes the revenues or what have you of the city?
Are you saying
Is this a distribution in stone, or is there a possibility it could be changed?
Well, council recommendations is that the proceeds be used as presented here today. You know, anything I imagine could be changed if there's a new council. I imagine they might set a new direction. It's unprecedented if that happens, or would be unprecedented if that happened. So don't want to say anything is etched in stone, which is to suggest that future councils could not change. But the bond as it is has to be used for affordable housing. That cannot change statutorily. Is those proceeds have to be used for affordable housing.
Do you see this bond, if it's approved, will it help move Raleigh away from pockets of poverty housing?
Where you mean there's a concentration, I imagine.
I think so. I'm not sure exactly. Maybe like where there was all low, very low income.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, part of the work that we do, and I think we all believe, and, you know, maybe it's more of a personal commentary that, you know, there should be housing options, you know, made available throughout the city of Raleigh. There are some districts who have in past, you know, wanted to know, why does all the affordable housing have to be in said district? So it's really important that those opportunities be made available, and hopefully it will help to create opportunities for people to live where they want to live in the city of Raleigh. So, you know, we shall see.
There's one question about the community engagement. Is the assumption we would make as far as engagement with more vulnerable areas if they had not been online? How did the group reach out? How did the city reach out, especially to the people who may be 30% AMI and the older population that may not be on email or other newspapers or whatever? How would they be heard if no in-person meetings were possible? I think you mentioned that they could call in, but they might not know about it. Also, the people surveyed, how much detail were they given regarding who the bond would help? Most people would support it if they hear affordable housing. Were they aware of the waiting list for units at 30% AMI? Were they aware there may not be enough units for the poorest people?
To answer that question, the is that we were going to involve the organizations that serve the vulnerable populations. And so it was their obligation to those that they serve, to when they came and participated in the process, that they were also bringing those perspectives. Could this Affordable Housing Bond Advisory Committee have been, you know, twice the size? No question. Could have been 3 times the size. And we were thinking of the best way that we can get that input while also making sure that we're going to be able to be responsive. And I think the process in my mind worked, right? Because out of our recommendations that we made back to council is that we wanted to see more emphasis placed on the 30% AMI population. That came out of the advisory group. And that came as a result of the people who were part of the conversation, who were representing those populations or that particular population. And to answer your question about the survey, no, there was not a question posed on the survey or information provided sharing with the community the need or the wait list for housing authority and the like.
I'd like to just add to sort of answer at a little higher level about the bond. In my experience with working with municipal governments, both at the county and the city level, across the state, across the country, that no bond is perfect. The amount that is selected is based on a lot of homework from both staff, whether at the municipal level, and in this case, City of Raleigh, with input from the folk who are on the front lines, whether it's you're building roads or planning for roads, or whether you're, in this case, you're building affordable housing, or in that realm where you're actually on the ground, like the nonprofit housing developers. So a lot of sweat equity is put into these efforts to work with elected officials who have to gauge both the public, which they've done, and also look at the pocketbook. Where can the city, in this case, how can the city develop a bond that, while not 100% perfect, addressing every single need that might be in the community, it's trying to gauge and get the best that they can get for the amount of money that they can go to the marketplace and bond. Again, I want to commend Yvette and all of the folk who have put a lot of effort into this to answer the call of the leadership of the council to put this bond out for both public input before the advocacy, and now the private side working to educate voters on the bond. So no bond's perfect, but again, a lot of work. And remember, extraordinary circumstances in terms of how to get input based on the pandemic that hit them square in the middle of reaching out to folks. But I would encourage on these technical questions that are coming up, I would encourage everyone who's participating today to go to the city of Raleigh, go to their, call your council person, the city manager's office, the planning office, the revenue office with these sort of technical email type questions. Those are highly encouraged. And in terms of, I saw one of the questions while I've got the floor. One of the questions was, were there any taxpayer dollars or any taxpayer dollars on the advocacy side? The answer to that is absolutely no. The city is charged with educating about the bond, which they have been doing. The committee is funded by citizens. It's funded by individuals, by organizations, by a lot of different folk who have said we agree with this, and they're helping funding the advocacy. So no tax dollars are allowed to be spent at all on advocating, and we are receiving no monies from any municipal government anywhere. So this is the advocacy side, the Vote Yes campaign is privately funded.
I think we have time for one more question. There's a question, aren't there 55,000 households in Wake County paying more than 30% of income for housing? Do you guys know the answer to that?
I will not confirm that number. I have a bunch of, I was looking at the question myself and hoping to pull up one of my trustee reference sheets here to confirm that number, but certainly can do that. We know, and I think the point here is that's where the greatest need is, right? And the thought that maybe the bond should just be lasered focused on that, but on that population, but understand that we are doing that. I mean, part of the recommendation is that we serve those at 30, those at 50, and those at 60% when it comes to the rental. And so I want to make sure that we're confirming current data. I know some of the data that's out there might be a little older. So I did see that number and would like an opportunity just to confirm that, if I may.
I'm going to turn it back over to Robin.
Thank you very much. And I'll turn it back over to Diane to close us out. We appreciate everyone participating today, and please contact us, anybody who participated in this today, as far as the league and the chamber. Contact us if you have any other questions. Everybody check out their website, so get a yard sign, and let's get this thing passed.
Great. Thank you all for your interest in this bond. It is an important issue, of course. This webinar has been recorded in a few days, most. It will be shared on our YouTube channel. So if you want to revisit, you can do that. Or if you want to direct anybody else to the video on our YouTube channel, they can then watch the webinar again. Thank you guys.